Hey there, my name is Vaughn, and this is the Vaughncast Show. This is a podcast that focuses on mental health, breaking societal stigmas, harm reduction, addiction, and recovery. If you like what you hear, subscribe and leave a review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Also, follow the podcast Instagram at the Vaughncast Show, where I post video content from the show. All right, let's get into today's episode. Welcome to the Vaughncast Show. Hope everyone's doing well. Today I got Nora back on the show. How are you today?
I like being a coming back guest.
Yeah, I like having you on the show.
It's fun.
Yeah.
I can't say I'm like excited about this topic, but I think it's an important one to talk about. So I'm glad we're able to talk about it.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I mean, I'm kind of like, damn, this is a really like draining topic, but I feel like at the end of the day, it is necessary to talk about. And there is, I guess, the good thing about it is hopefully we can provide some resources and some education behind this topic. So this topic is domestic violence. Just a heads up for those listening, trigger warning. Yeah, I feel like this is an important topic to talk about, something not to stay silent about because it's pretty prevalent. And I wanted Nora on the show because she is a trained domestic violence counselor.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah. Where to start? This is
Well,
not, yeah,
I think I think maybe a place like part of why I know you and I wanted to have this conversation is because it's so common and it's so like common in a way where we don't always even recognize it. And there's so much shame and stigma around it. And for me, one of the things I love about your podcast actually is that you talk about things, you destigmatize things and you de-shame things. And so I don't know, there's something that feels like this is the right topic to talk about with you on this podcast because it's something that so many people experience. And part of the reason why they don't talk about it is because there's so much shame, there's so much misinformation, there's so much stigma, there's so much victim blaming. And so, yeah, I think it's important to talk about because for all the reasons I just said, it's so common and people don't talk about it, and talking about it is one of the best ways to push back and fight against it.
right, 100%. And also, I wanted to start with some statistics I saw. As of April 2024, the CDC reported that in the US, more than 1 in 3 women, 33.3%, and 1 in 4 men, 25%, have experienced physical violence, sexual assault, or stalking by an intimate partner in their lifetime. And also, they report that nearly 1 in 4 women, 24.3%, and 1 in 7 men, 13.8%, have experienced severe physical violence by an intimate partner. And that's a lot. That's like you're putting 3 women in a room, one of them have experienced this, or 4 men in a room, one of them experienced this. So it seems like those stats don't seem like a lot, but they actually are.
Yeah, and that's just physical violence. It's not emotional or psychological abuse, which is often so much harder to name and talk about. And I would bet that those statistics are also underreported because a lot of people won't talk about it for different reasons.
Yeah. I guess we can start with the different types of abuse I found online. There's the physical abuse, emotional and verbal abuse, financial abuse, digital abuse, and stalking. So I think the physical abuse is more, you can kind of tell physically just by someone with bruises and whatnot, but the other ones are more subtle.
Yeah, and I think what's important, maybe like a place to start, is to even define what is abuse, because there's a difference between acts of violence, which might be like you push someone or you versus um, abuse, and especially abuse in this context, which is a pattern. It's a very systemic pattern of control and coercion. And so that part, it's violence used to control someone. It's violence used to coerce someone. And there's a pattern of it over time. So to the point where sometimes you might not recognize something that's happening between people as abuse, but in that dynamic, a victim might know that when he grabs a certain pen, or if he gets a certain look in his eyes, because it's become such a pattern in their relationship that it doesn't even always look like these kind of bold, extreme things that we expect it to look like, because it's become because of that pattern of control and coercion. So physical abuse is the most common one, and it's the most like tangible one. But like you said, emotional and psychological abuse, financial abuse is a big one. Cyber abuse, stalking as an extension, sometimes it's part of all of that. And a lot of times they overlap. So you'll see multiple kinds of abuse in the same dynamic.
Yeah. And I also looked up, why does this occur? And like you said, it's to maintain power and control. And it's really sad that it has to come to this, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. I can't say anything else, but yeah, it's really sad.
Right. Can you talk about the power dynamics in a DV situation? How does that work? What it is?
Um, so the violence or the threat of violence is used to maintain power and control in that relationship. It looks different in every relationship because one of the things about domestic violence is that it cuts across class, race, education level, jobs, like you name it. There's no like one group that's like more of a victim than others or more of a perpetrator. It really does cut across. So the dynamic's really different. Sometimes you have an abuser who won't allow someone to work, who won't allow their partner to work because they want to have all the financial control. And sometimes you have an abuser who forces their partner to work because they want to exploit their financial labor. Both of those are financial abuse, but from two very different sides of it. So that's one of the things that I think makes it hard is because it can look so many different ways, but the core of it is this pattern of, again, forcing someone, coercing someone, and using the threat of violence, to get someone else to do something that the perpetrator wants them to do. It's also things like they might threaten to out you. They might threaten your immigration status. They might threaten your animals. They might threaten to call child protective services. They might threaten to tell a secret to the, like it's those kinds of things that to the outside world, someone might not see it, but those dynamics exist. Those invisible dynamics exist very strongly.
Yeah. I like how you describe other different situations because like you said, it might be very subtle, but definitely I can see how kind of blackmailing or using like something as leverage against somebody that's also a form of abuse. And I think for most people, they might say like, well, if you're in a shitty situation, you're in an abusive situation, why don't you just leave? Can you talk to us why some people just can't simply walk away?
That's a great question. The other version of that is, oh, I can't hear about it anymore. Stop talking to me about this. So I know people say those things out of the most well-intentioned, but the impact that it has on a victim, on someone who's experiencing abuse, it can be very isolating. It can be very dismissive. And it doesn't work. That kind of like tough love, like, I'm going to stop talking to you until you leave him. All that does is further push a victim into that situation. And we can talk about that more later. People stay for a variety of reasons. One is that because of these coercive power dynamics, he might have your passport. He might threaten to out you. He might have incriminating or embarrassing photos. So the fear is that if you leave, he's going to cause harm. That's one. Another reason people stay is that sometimes it's safer to stay. And men, especially, my expertise, my most familiarity is in male-female dynamics, but men often escalate when someone leaves. That's the most dangerous part for women when they leave an abusive relationship. And so sometimes it's safer to stay and navigate and manage a violent situation than leave when there's a threat of escalation, especially if there's like guns or weapons or things like that in the house. That's another reason people stay. The other part of it is domestic violence does so much psychological damage, right? In addition to like the physical violence, there's often messages of you're not good enough. I'm the only person that you have. No one, no one's going to believe you is a very common refrain. People are often alienated and isolated, so they don't have a support system to fall back on. And so there's a lot of difficult emotionally. There's not enough support, and logistically, he might have access to all the bank accounts, so you don't have, the keys to the car, or you're afraid for the kids. So there's a lot of reasons that people stay. And the other one is, oftentimes part of the cycle of abuse is that the abuser is both the cause of harm, but also the person who makes it all better, which in and of itself is a manipulative tactic. But there's that's intentional, because then when something gets tough, the abuser has conditioned and created conditions that the person will go back to them, even when things are tough, which is also why people often, like, the stereotype is that people leave like 7 times, but it's not really that they leave and go back. It's more of like a gradual process of separation, because sometimes that's safer than cutting it off completely. So, I know that's kind of a convoluted answer, but it's because the people stay for a myriad of different reasons. And the best thing that people can do is, if you know someone who was in that situation, to stay supportive, to continue to be, you don't have to accept what they're doing. It's perfectly okay to say, you know what, I worry about you, but I'm here for you. They need to know that there's someone who will believe them and who will be there for them. Can I add one more thing?
Yeah, sure.
Because this is when you're like the person you're supporting, your friend, whatever, when they leave, it's very tempting to be like, I knew that man was a piece of shit. Try to avoid that. And I'll tell you why, even though you're probably right. But the reason you want to avoid that is because they might go back, and then you can be not framed in like the police sense, but like you can be positioned as a negative person. And then they might push you out because you've been critical of like the relationship. So you might be all right, but it's helpful and safer to remain neutral as you're supporting someone in leaving, and just validate their experiences, ask questions, like, all of that kind of stuff, but try to avoid it. Like, I knew he was a piece of shit. Fuck that guy. Sorry, can I cuss on your podcast?
Of course.
I was like, I think I can. But yeah, so that's just another we do all this like well-intentioned stuff that sometimes in this context, because we don't understand it, it's honestly, like, dealing with domestic violence is like playing chess.
Right. Yeah, I like how you gave all those examples, and it's good to learn to know what to say and what not to say. Because yeah, I can see how you can say, "Oh, this person wasn't good, was a piece of shit." But I didn't realize that how it can be framed as you kind of like, I don't know, you just when you say that, you kind of make them feel bad, and then they might not want to get help, or they might not like reach out to you afterwards. I never thought of it that way.
Because it's like, let's say I'm leaving a situation, right? And you're helping me, and you're like, oh, that piece of shit, fuck that guy. Okay, cool. For whatever reason, I decide to go back. Maybe he has something that's very important to me, or he's whatever. For whatever reason, I decide to go back. It's likely within those dynamics of abuse that he's going to ask me a lot of questions about whoever, if he knows, and it could be because he's stalking or whatever, he's going to know that you helped me. And then he's going to start getting in my ear about, oh, well, that Vaughn doesn't really like you. And he's always been so jealous of our relationship. And, oh, he's just trying to get at you. And, oh, yeah, I'm sure he was saying all these bad things about me. And he's going to, and again, if he's controlling the relationship, he might, and I might learn explicitly or not, that if I continue to interact with you, it's going to cause me harm and violence, not by any fault of yours, but because of the narrative that he's created. So it just creates another buffer of safety for me if I were to go back in that situation where I'm like, oh, he said nothing but good things about you. And he was trying to tell me to, whatever. And so it's tricky because, again, for you to be supportive, you can help people safety plan, you can help people leave. You just want to stay a little bit neutral until you know that it's like for real that they've left or that it's the final leaving. Yeah, it's tricky.
Yeah, I can see it being difficult because people go back. I've seen relationships where, they know this person is not good for them, but they come back, go back to them. Sometimes I feel frustrated, but after what you said, there's a lot of mind games involved, and you just kind of have to be patient and just be there for them, even though it can be really difficult. Sometimes I feel like, I feel like I don't know, they're frustrated over it sometimes because I've seen friends go back to relationships that are not so healthy. But with what you say, you just got to be patient and understanding. I mean, I doubt you can't even compare it, but maybe it's like a relapse with drugs. Like you can tell somebody, yeah, drugs are bad for you, this, and that. And this person says, okay, cool, I'm not touching it again. But then they go back to it and it's like, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? But then I'm learning that a lot of times it's like, it's so ingrained as like a coping mechanism that you feel safe doing drugs, even though it can be really dangerous. So that's how I connected it when you were talking about it. That and if someone relapses, you shouldn't be too tough on them. Just be accepting and just be there and understand that it happens.
That's actually such a good parallel. And so in the same way that, like, if someone's going to do drugs, you're going to give them, here's your fentanyl strips and here's your Narcan and let's like harm reduction. There is a harm reduction approach to domestic violence that can at least, okay, if you're going to stay, what can we do to keep you safe? Can we help you set up a bank account that he doesn't know about? Or do you want to keep your important documents at my house? Or, you can always come bring the kids to you can set up these like safety plans and the harm reduction approach, which then might make it easier and easier and easier for the person to leave if that's what they choose to do. And you're right. It is like a drug because the abuser, again, they're partly because they've isolated you from everyone. So that becomes your whole support system. And then partly because when it gets really, really bad, then the abuser is going to be like, I'm so sorry, hugs and kisses, here's a gift. And so they're the problem, but they've also made themselves the solution to the problem.
Yeah, it's kind of weird because now I think about it, there's that term like you abuse drugs. Yeah, I just saw
Yeah.
that parallel now. But yeah, that's kind of trippy how that works. But I like how you said about the harm reduction with those situations where little by little you can be there for them in terms of keeping important documents or being a place for the kids to go when things aren't going well. And I feel like when you do that little by little, they might gain strength from gain enough strength to leave that situation over time. Because unless maybe it's super serious, they may not leave right away. It may just be like, oh, he did this one time or they did this one time, and then it happens again, or yeah.
And so what you can you reflecting that could be really helpful. You said, oh, this one time, it's been 1 times that you've just told me about. Or, you can say, I mean, part of it is when you're in that abusive dynamic, it becomes really normal to you because our brains, for better or for worse, have an amazing ability to adapt. So we can get used to shitty things fairly quickly and fairly well. And so when they come to you and they're talking about it, it might be one of the few opportunities that they have to talk about it. And so it's in talking to you that they might be like, oh shit, when I say that out loud, that doesn't sound good. And so and so that's part of like when you're, when we hear people say like, I can't hear about this anymore, but the process of talking about it and naming it and starting to identify that, like, you know what, that actually isn't okay. That in and of itself can be really helpful. The other piece is what happens in domestic violence is that your power is often taken away from you. And so allowing the person to make decisions, even if they're not decisions that you agree with, is part of how they can start to get their power back, right? They decide if they want to leave or if they want to stay. They decide if they want to leave things at your house or they want to leave it in the car. Right? Making those decisions becomes a way to experience having power again when you've been so disempowered in such an intimate relationship.
Right. Yeah, that's well said. So why do you feel like people being abused or have gone through this stuff, they tend to stay silent, right? Because people, you would think that, oh, if you're dealing with to say something, but oftentimes they don't.
I mean, look at how our society treats people, and especially women who speak up. We victim blame, we shame, we dismiss them, even when they have all the proof, right? We continue to celebrate violent men, right? And put them in all these positions of power. And so there's culturally that message. And then there's not a lot of systems designed to support women or to support victims. You can get a restraining order, which is, if you want to like work in go through the surveillance police field, you could get a surveillance restraining order. That's only as good as it's enforceable, right? Otherwise, it's like a piece of paper. So we don't really have systems to protect people. And then oftentimes when people do turn to those systems, the systems themselves are patriarchal and problematic and abusive and violent. And so as a culture, we don't talk about it because it challenges so much of the way that our culture is built and run. A lot of that, like I said, is rooted in how dismissive people are of women and things that women experience. Because it's easy to be like, oh, that's a personal problem. You're not. There's something wrong with you because you're a victim. Versus saying, our society has created these men and the men are wrong for behaving that way, right? That's like classic victim blaming. So I think it's a combination of those things. And that's why I think having conversations like this, or even how we respond to public instances of abuse and how we react about like those things in pop culture moments, your friends are watching. Your friends are seeing how you react to these things, and they know who's a safe person and who's not a safe person.
Right. And also too, I can't help but think that like for men who are abused in relationships, it might be difficult as well because it's like, what? They won't be believed, kind of like you got hit, like, they might laugh, oh, your girlfriend hit you, like, what the fuck? Like they might make a joke out of it, or they might, oh, like, you're the man, how come you're dealing with this? How come you're putting up with this kind of stuff? So I can imagine like it must be difficult for men too because it's almost like unheard of. Usually it's one way around, but yeah, it's just interesting that way. And I feel like men would be less likely to speak up because of that pressure and a societal like uh because of society stuff.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The numbers with men are definitely underreported, similar to in same-sex relationships where they're like, oh, women don't abuse women. Like, like it could never happen. And so you're absolutely right, because it becomes a place where homophobia converges, where patriarchy converges, where gender roles converge, and all of those problems that those systems cause, we see it in this very interpersonal dynamic and our cultural response to it.
Right. Yeah. So this might be obvious, but what are the impacts on the victims in long term? I mean, like obviously you get the cuts and bruises, but I feel like it does do something over time.
I mean, everyone's different. Um, and we all experience trauma. Like we all experience all kinds of trauma. Um, but it's anytime there's a violation of your safety, whether it's through domestic violence or anything else, like lack of, having a hard time trusting people, having a hard time feeling safe, hypervigilance, um, anxiety, depression. Sometimes there's very like long-term physical effects depending on what like the violence was like. Sometimes there's long-term economic, people are in debt and they have to deal with getting out of debt. Um, there's a lot of grief because I don't want to, we're talking like very kind of heady, but also at some point you love this person and there's a grief over the relationship not being what you thought it was, right? Like there's heartbreak, there's grief. Um, yeah, I mean, it's all the things that trauma might cause. And I want to say like, it's also not hopeless, right? Like there's support groups and there's therapists that specialize in this, and there's a ton of books and there's tons and tons of resources. And so, um, it's not like your life is ruined for the rest of your life. There is, in the same way using the addiction metaphor, there is recovery. Um, there is recovery.
Right. Yeah, I think that's something that people, when they're in those situations, it may seem like it's hard to get out, but yeah, there's definitely resources and ways to get help. Um, so how would you, I mean, I'm sure this is a very like general question, but what are some steps you can take to get out of these situations from your experience? What have you seen like that works?
Um, Again, each situation is different and nobody knows their abuser like an abuse victim. So you might think something's a good idea and a victim might be like, nope, he's going to beat the shit out of me if I do that. So always like deferring to the victim. Um, Things that help is having like, one is the logistics, having money put aside, keeping cash, having like all your important documents so that if you need to leave, you don't have to worry about leaving things behind. Um, Really building a support system. Isolation is one of the most like one of the first things that they'll start to do, talk bad about your friends, won't let you see your friends, like that kind of stuff. And so building or rebuilding your support systems. And as a friend, if this is someone who's reaching out to you after a long time, to be compassionate and responsive rather than like, oh, you left me. And it's not personal. Like it's not personal at all. So building friends, really just any kind of like self-care where you're building yourself up. There's got to be a counter narrative to the like negative self-talk that your abuser is giving you. Um, Support groups. I highly, 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 highly recommend support groups. And there's a bunch, and I'm sure we can share them in like the show notes and stuff, especially but now post pandemic, there's virtual ones, there's phone ones, there's in-person ones, there's, if you can get to your own therapy and work with your own therapist, like that's really helpful. Having a safety plan, and there's a lot of like domestic, like there's the National Domestic Violence Hotline and other agencies that will help you safety plan. So you can work with someone who's an expert to talk about, okay, here's if this, then that, if this, then that, and you can safety plan. So just having a plan if you decide to leave. Yeah, those I would say would be maybe some of the top most important things.
Right. Okay. And then we mentioned some resources like therapy, self or group support groups for those. Um, yeah, I think those are pretty big. And also like seeing a domestic violence counselor. Like where does one go for those? Where do you find those?
So National Domestic Violence Hotline. has like they can refer you to local stuff. A lot of those places will have information about like safety search and things like that, so that if your abuser is tracking your phone or tracking your internet usage, like it won't show up. I don't know the technology behind it, but something like that to keep you safe. But they can help you find all the resources to whether it's a support group or a counselor. They also have, I volunteered at a place that had like a legal clinic. So if you need help with the restraining order, or if there's like children involved, there's lawyers I would say that's something helpful to think about, is if you're if you're dealing with legal stuff, finding legal representation who's familiar with domestic violence, because abusers sometimes act differently in court, and they're not always as predictable as you might think them to be. So someone who understands like those nuances can be helpful to have in your corner if you're going through a legal situation.
Right. Also, too, something I thought of just now, I feel like sometimes people in these situations, they might feel like it's their fault in terms of like, why did I get with this person? And they end up being so much different than they were. But I just know that, like you said, sometimes people put on a mask or they act different in the beginning, but then little by little, they show their true colors. And I feel like by the time they show their true colors, it might be really difficult to get out of it, or you don't realize it until it's too late. So I just want to say that just to like not feel too bad about, not to feel too bad that, it's not your fault. If you're dealing with these things, like, oh, how could I have gotten with this person? And a lot of times they hide these things in the beginning. And then as time goes on, I feel like they start having these control tendencies.
100%, right? Like the first time if someone just raged, you'd be like, I'm out. But they start with subtle, small things, and you let it go, or you make excuses, or you don't think too much about it. And then next thing it's like, what is it when they say like they put a lobster and the lobster slowly cooks? Like, it's like that. You're like a lobster being cooked alive, because the water doesn't start at 100 degrees. The water starts at a nice like room temperature, and then you're slowly boiled alive. So it's not your fault. And like I said, domestic violence happens to all kinds, like across the board, across income, jobs. Like there's no victim prototype. It literally can happen to anybody.
Yeah, 100%. Well, I think that's pretty much all we got for this topic. We've covered a lot. So thank you. Thank you for having this talk with me about domestic violence. I'll definitely post some links in the show notes.
Thank you for creating the space to talk about it.
100%. And again, for people listening to this that are going through it, there's definitely help. It's not, it's not hopeless, but there's definitely help. And I think now there's social media and internet, and there's other ways to communicate and get out there and get your story out there and reach out to people. So I think that's it. Well, thank you, Nora. Have
Thanks.
a good rest of your day.